Hey, my friends, it's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Thanks for bumming around with me here and thinking about the book of Esther. A while back when we worked our way all the way through the book of Matthew, one of the questions we had to pause and reflect on from time to time as we got into some of the very specific details in that story was, how did Matthew know these things? How did he come into contact with the knowledge of, say, what happened during the Transfiguration? Well, probably the three guys who went up there with Jesus told him about it. That one's not too tough. But how did Matthew come into the knowledge of the stuff that Pontius Pilate said? Well, maybe he was out there in the crowd somewhere, or maybe somebody who he knew was out there in the crowd. Well, how did Matthew come to know what Jesus prayed when he was in the garden? Ooh, well, that gets trickier because Jesus got arrested right after that. Well, maybe Jesus told him after the resurrection, or maybe, Christians believe that God supernaturally reveals things to the authors of Scripture. Maybe some of this stuff is supernaturally revealed, but my guess would tend to be that most of the stuff that Matthew knows that is in his book, he knows from pound and pavement, taking copious notes and working hard and asking good questions. Luke goes out of his way to spell out that that is how he knows the stuff he knows. He conducted a bunch of interviews and he asked around a whole lot to compose the book of Luke and then the follow-up volume of the book of Acts. Well, if we stop and we ask a similar question here about the book of Esther, I think it actually points us a little more closely to who might have written this thing or what kind of person might have written this thing. Now, of course, there are books of the Bible where the name of the book of the Bible is who wrote it. So the Gospels, for example, are held out as being written by the people whose names are on them. Now, there are people usually using pretty antiquated arguments at this point, arguments from 10 years ago, 20 years ago that are increasingly becoming harder and harder to defend. There are people who you will hear argue that those Gospels were written much, much later by other people. You'll hear the argument that the names on the Gospels were given after the fact to lend credibility to the Gospels, but that doesn't make sense. If you were going to do that, you'd put Peter on there. You wouldn't put Mark on there. Mark got fired from a mission trip. How hard is it to accomplish that? All you got to do is do some mimes and probably give out some gummy bears or something to some kids in a little village or something. Maybe take a few selfies of yourself and just put it on Facebook and say how much the thing changed you. And then at the end, be at the campfire with everybody else and just be like, okay, guys, it's my turn. At first I didn't want to go on this trip, but now I'm really glad I did. I'm going to miss you all so much. It's just really hard to get fired from a mission trip is the point. And that guy did. And you're trying to tell me that somebody put his name on a gospel to make it look more credible when in reality it was written 100 years later by somebody else? Come on. I think the most likely explanation is what all of the earliest sources are in agreement upon, and that's that the people whose names are on the gospels wrote the gospels. But Esther is different. The name on the book of Esther is not the name of the author. There's no suggestion that this is somehow autobiographical. Nobody thinks Esther wrote it, and you don't even need to go and explore a whole bunch of stuff and become a great scholar to figure it out. You just read it until it isn't held out as being that. It's not really held out as a theological history even in the same way that the Gospels are, or even that Ezra and Nehemiah are. It feels like Esther might be the only book of its specific subgenre in the entire Bible, because it is definitely using storytelling style and rhythms and pacing and characterizations, but yet it's also dealing with things that were incredibly well documented and well known, at least the big details. So it would have been easy to fact check for an original audience, but Esther also demonstrates a real insider knowledge of what's going on here. So right now, we've been working on Esther chapter 1 and this big incident that ruins this lovely party that demands a meeting within a meeting within a meeting within a meeting to sort out what ought to be done now that Queen Vashti has refused Xerxes' request, whatever the specifics of Xerxes' request might have actually been. And the author of Esther now is giving us these lists of names that are incredibly specific. How familiar with the inner workings of the court of the great King of Kings do you have to be to just reel off the name of the 7 eunuchs who are working most closely with King Xerxes. I mean, to reel them off, let alone pronounce them. Man, I continue to just Mehuman, Bitzha, Arbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass. Man, that is a brutal lineup. But not only could the person who did this pronounce that, they could spell it and they could remember it, and that's really impressive. How familiar do you have to be with the inner workings of King Xerxes' court to just immediately off the top of your head also reel off these 7 probable descendants of Darius's co-conspirators who were probably part of the sweetheart deal that put Darius on the throne in the first place? And the author here, he knows all of their names just right off the bat, nails them. There they are, all of them. And additionally, how familiar do you have to be with this place to know all of the details of how these 2 parties are going? I mean, there's a public element to this party that maybe lots of people in Susa would have known, but whoever's here, and they know what kind of stones are being used in this construction. They know about the patio furniture made of precious metals. They know that there's a private party that's going on at the end of the public party, and that there's a version for the ladies and that there's a version for the dudes. They know about the inner workings of what happened at the dude party that Vashti refused to attend. And they seem to know the inner workings of the secret meeting within a meeting within a meeting within a meeting that these elite advisors who have unlimited access to the king are conducting in response to the slight that Queen Vashti has leveled against King Xerxes. I think what that tells us is that we're dealing with someone who, well, first of all, is very pro-Jewish and pro-God. I mean, if you haven't caught it yet, as we work further through Esther, you'll see that this book is very sympathetic to the Jewish people and very not sympathetic to the age-old enemy of the Jewish people. So we know the author is pro-Jew, but we also know the author has an incredible working knowledge of fine details within the court of King Xerxes. Well, much like we asked the question, how did Matthew know this? How did Matthew know that? How would he have gotten that detail? How did he know that? We got to kind of game that out. We can ask the same kind of questions of Esther chapter 1 here and be like, well, who would have this set of perspectives, biases, preferences, this pro-Jew orientation, but also be close enough to know all of this stuff? Well, I can think of 2 characters that immediately come to mind, and they're in this book. One is Esther, meaning that maybe she isn't the author of the book, but maybe she's the main source of the book, that she would be privy to all of this, and maybe she spelled all of that out for somebody who did write it down. Somebody like maybe Mordecai, who we will see as this book unfolds, is the other main Jewish character of the book. He's going to end up with a lot of behind-the-scenes access to the royal court of Xerxes here in Susa. Maybe he was able to gather everything he needed to get the details right and compose this story the way he did. There's another tradition that says a later group of the elders of the great synagogue, I suppose that would be Babylon. I think that's what that means when you hear the great synagogue, that maybe they did it as a group project and they worked together, which means that they would have had opportunities to access stuff that had maybe been recorded by Esther, maybe by Mordecai, maybe by others, maybe court records. Who knows? I suppose that is a possibility, but maybe also Ezra or Nehemiah writing in the reign of Xerxes' son, Artaxerxes. Maybe they would have had access to enough of this information to cobble it all together as well. On the surface, it's not a great look for Xerxes in this book, but to the person who is a part of the contemporary audience, or maybe Xerxes himself or his son Artaxerxes, they might look at this and be like, well, in the end, people tried to manipulate the great king, but they couldn't get one over on him, and he made all the right and just decisions, and this book of Esther is a celebration of his great leadership. So it may be just the way the pitches are framed regarding the track record of Xerxes here. Maybe it was written by somebody in the court of Xerxes or in the court of Artaxerxes. Whatever the case, what we're definitely seeing here is insider knowledge. Now, Herodotus gives us some of that, writing a little bit later on, but Herodotus seems to be unapologetic in his presentation in giving massive, multi-page quotes to these characters in these settings that he couldn't possibly have had verbatim. There's just no way. I mean, there's no theological mechanism with the secular historian Herodotus to be like, well, then, God opened his eyes to the truth of what was said and revealed word for word exactly what the 5-page quote was. We don't really even see that in the Bible anywhere. Even the teachings of Jesus that come in big blocks are probably teachings that were repeated multiple times, and people would have been there scribing that and writing it down. The way Herodotus reports the dramatic, big speeches of all of these colorful characters seems to be self-identifying as, this isn't exactly what Xerxes said, but this gives you the idea of what he wanted and what his attitude was all about. This isn't what Artabanus said in the meeting, but the gist was he just wanted to offer another opinion, and then Xerxes got mad. Whereas the speeches that we're getting here in Esther, they gist it a lot harder, to the point where I think there's a higher likelihood of reliability that this is either holding itself out as saying, no, this is what they said, or this is a completely fair distillation of what was said. So I think whoever is giving us the book of Esther is playing by a little different set of ground rules than Herodotus, and we're receiving information from them that is held out as different in its level of veracity and specificity. It's very fun to think about. And I think one of the really interesting things about Esther is how well the behavior of the characters squares with everything we seem to know about them, or the feel we get about them from the extra biblical sources as well. So as we dive deeper into this meeting within a meeting within a meeting within a meeting tomorrow to see how these elites who were descended from Darius's co-conspirators counsel Xerxes, I think it's fair to say that what we're getting is a pretty intimate, detailed, behind closed doors view of the proceedings here. And I think that gives us a little bit of a hint of what kind of person might be our storyteller here, which is interesting. All right, back to the meeting tomorrow. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.